Hey everyone, David here with another Arcadian Rift devlog, a sci-fi FPS game I've been developing in Unreal Engine. Right out of the gate this last month, I got to all the feedback and bug fixing from the first alpha testing. Huge thanks to all the patrons who left feedback, as it led to a ton of fixes, improvements, polish. I put all the responses into a doc to organize things that were mentioned kind of more often, or maybe higher priority, and then I got to work. And in literally like 2 days of just focused work, I got almost every single bug, polished feature, all that stuff just fixed up, improved. I made a big change log, which I posted on my Discord, which is way too long to go over in this video, and it kind of covers all the stuff you can just kind of read on the screen now. However, a few things worth discussing. You can now move held objects closer and further by scrolling, which makes playing around with things a little more fun now. When you don't have enough energy to use your equipped ability, the energy bar will turn gray on your HUD, making it easier to know if you can do something like a dash if you see the bar orange. Players' mines can now manually be shot, as well as there being a system to prevent the player from just laying an infinite amount of mines. Adding camera shake to the player when the shield ability gets hit, updated the enemy look ahead function to take distance into account a little bit better, so now they're a little more accurate and not so easy to kind of cheese. I added support for toggle sprint and toggle crouch, which was something players were asking for. I implemented a community feature I saw in the comments of the last devlog, where the weapon lights will now actually power off if you have no ammo in the magazine, and then power back on the moment you're able to start shooting again. I might do a little bit more nuance with this later, but I think it's a good addition for now. I updated the Squall's slow effect that appears on enemies, which now dynamically applies to the actual shape of the enemy's skeleton. This means that I can apply the same effect to just all future enemies without having to design, different shapes and sizes of the effect to kind of fit all the different enemies. It also just looks a lot better and is a lot more readable to the player. And finally, with the help of my friend Simon, I was finally able to fix a problem where the player would spin kind of on physicalized objects, which were also spinning, which was just being super annoying. If you just walked over like a small prop and that little prop kind of rotated a bit, it would suddenly rotate the player as they were walking, which, if you're just walking forward and suddenly now you're walking at a diagonal, it was just really confusing. It goes really against a lot of my kind of basic design philosophy stuff, but that's all fixed now. You can now walk over things and you maintain the same direction. After I got through all this, my next focus was on the in-game menu. I figured I'd have to solve this eventually, so it'd be important to just get fully working as soon as possible. That way testers and patrons would be able to have an easier time kind of configuring their settings and stuff like the toggle crouch, toggle sprint to make testing a little easier on them. While I was able to get most of the UI set up, I found myself struggling vastly with the actual settings menu. I'm not really good with the Unreal Engine interface stuff right now, and especially trying to get all the settings stuff working. It's just not working, so I got an asset on the marketplace which just handles all the video settings and everything. And by kind of modifying that slightly, I was able to add the support for my own features, like the toggle sprint and crouch stuff. And then I reformatted my own pause menu, gave it some nice animation and visual relook kind of design to match the new settings menu, so everything feels consistent. Definitely that saved me like a week of work. I then got to work on the main goal of the month, which was adding new enemies. This began by finishing the tank, which I had started ages ago, and you've probably seen driving around the back of my devlogs. This enemy doesn't randomly roam, but instead follows predefined paths and is relatively slow but much more heavily armored. This allows the player to kind of bypass this enemy entirely by knowing that it'll follow the path and not just, like other enemies might just stop, turn around and face them, so players can kind of expect what it's going to be doing a little more. The player can go behind the tank where it won't be kind of looking as much. However, if they sneak behind to avoid the detection, they lose sight on the tank's critical point in the front. Which brings me to my next feature I added, critical hits. This is something I've been wanting for a while, where if the player shoots the enemy in the kind of bright red triangle point, a specific sound will play, as well as a bright kind of red flash effect I created, which lets the player know they are dealing critical damage and not just normal hits, and in doing so you'll deal bonus damage, and lets the player be a little more accurate if they want to, and not just kind of shoot randomly everywhere. I then had to update all my weapons to allow for critical hits, as well as all the enemies to receive them, but I used this opportunity to make sure all the kind of critical hit points were quite clear and consistent between the enemies that had them. I also ensured all the enemies were properly set up with the kind of slow system and the slow effects, as well as modeling all the remaining kind of destroyed versions of the enemy and set that stuff up too. So now all the existing enemies would be like 100% complete and not accidentally missing some of the new features. I then got back to making actual new enemies and began working on some floating mine things. The idea here was that these enemies float and fly completely, and they're not dependent on kind of pathfinding along the floor, which adds a new dynamic to encounters, as these things can come straight towards you even if you're like up on a ledge or an otherwise unreachable area. And I spent a while running tests and experiments while watching lots of tutorials and practicing as much as I could, as doing flying enemies was something different than what I've done before. I can't simply just use the navigation system, which means enemies don't have like a way of just, oh, find the player. Instead of having them fly, straight towards the player, which I could have done, I wanted to make it a little more like, they randomly strafe around, a little harder to shoot. So I spent a while kind of adding the randomness stuff, as well as I added little whiskers, invisible whiskers, which allow them to kind of detect oncoming geometry, and they try to find an optimal way of at least avoiding geometry and kind of flying around it. And while these definitely aren't smart, they're also a lot less dumb than if I had just made it so they just, head straight to the player. And they're actually pretty efficient. I'd probably say they're actually even more efficient than ground enemies as far as they don't have to do like complex pathfinding. So nice little fun enemy to just kind of shoot. I then was getting sick of the default starter content kind of explosion effects, which honestly looked really awful and empty. It just looked like a kind of bright flash. So I got a good looking explosion pack and have been replacing all the old junky ones for ones that feel a little more accurate to the actual size of the item being destroyed. I then set up a little more optimal way of doing the explosions where I have the camera shakes attached to the explosions, so I don't have to set up the camera shakes manually each time, which was good because I didn't actually have the camera shakes in the game before. I'd kind of not gotten around to that, which now makes the explosions overall just feel a little better, more intense. I did some customization, of course, to make them fit a little more of what I needed, a little more chunks of metal when the big metal things were destroyed. I did have a little bit too much fun with it at one point. Before working on any more enemies, I spent some time building out a new combat level, a combat testing level, which would be used to test enemy combat as well as environmental design for the game, weapons, abilities. The previous testing level wasn't built to test these kind of things. This was something I kind of gradually developed all month. Back to enemies, I made a laser drone, took a few concept ideas before I found a design I liked, but the idea of this enemy is that it's quite accurate and deals sustained damage, so it isn't something you can dodge like most of the other enemies, although there is a bit of a kind of wiggle and randomness, so he isn't perfectly locked on like he was at first. This enemy gives the player an opportunity to use things like the shield or the dash to cover, as the lasers are very clearly indicated when they're about to fire, so it makes it kind of more of a high threat enemy. I did, however, have one weird problem with this drone for a moment. While doing this enemy, I thought it time to update my laser VFX, as it was an old effect I made ages ago, and was honestly super cheap looking, so now the red lasers as well as the loot lasers have a nice visual overhaul. For the next enemy, I was going to turn the old placeholder owl enemies into actual enemies, however I felt the design would look a little too contradicting with it didn't have the nice critical triangles that I had just made, and also they felt kind of cute and adorable until they suddenly pulled a Glock on you. Instead, I went for the kind of archetype of a shielded enemy, like jackals or Cerberus shield guys in Mass Effect 3. This enemy uses a shield similar to the player's, with a hole in the middle where we can hit. The AI on this one actually is a little more complex, as I've been trying to push my AI abilities and learn a little more. When the shield goes down, he'll actually go into a new fleeing state and try to find kind of hidden cover, since he's more vulnerable and susceptible to damage without the shield. Also, instead of just moving towards the player in kind of random locations, it actually finds areas towards the player, but still in sight of the player, which avoids it doing really dumb things like just moving behind a wall and then trying to shoot the player, or just driving past the player to a random point behind them. Overall, this enemy probably feels one of the best. Near the end of the month, I wanted to finalize a few things which I knew would show up during the next round of testing. The first was updating the damage indicator. I broke the effect apart into 6 different versions, one for each direction. I then added some extra data to my damage function to provide a source location which then allowed me to calculate where the damage was coming from, so you could see, like, the player could be indicated if suddenly they get hit from the right side or the left side, or it's kind of hard to tell the front and back apart right now, but if, you know, if you're getting attacked from the front, you'll probably know, as well as up and down and whatnot. It also has been visually updated to look a little bit better, and also remade to support 4K. And finally, I got it to render behind the player's HUD, whereas previously it had been rendering on top of the HUD and actually covering up things like the player's health, which was like the worst time to not know how much health you have. And finally, the updated Kraken, which is now called the Leviathan, thanks to everyone who suggested that name in the comments last video. The missiles now home in on enemies randomly in their sight, and the effects have been overhauled a lot to feel a bit beefier with smoke trails. They definitely look a lot less like bottle rockets, but I still think the sound effects is what's really going to sell it eventually. I did have one weird issue with the missiles, which led to some goofy behavior. And that's all, folks. And that's all, folks. Folks. Who says folks or folks? Yeah, I don't actually know how people say that. The next alpha build will be given out to all my patrons in a few days, and I'm definitely going to, you know, assess the feedback on the various environmental areas to figure out what design of the environment lends itself best to the style of game, and, you know, which environments are kind of the worst. The way I actually laid out the level is kind of in like an open world and a linear world, and different types of linear design, and each one is going to kind of, you know, help test different ideas, different designs. As always, big thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. I'm always looking for new ideas or rewards to give out, so let me know if you have any ideas. That's all for now, though, and I hope to see everyone next month.